Albemarle County government is excited about this topic. I want to thank today's panelists first. Dr. Erin Mathieu, Brian Morse, Albemarle County Fire Rescue Deputy Chief Emily Palicha, Corinne de Cardenas, and our climate manager, Gabe Daly, who organized this evening's event. Thank you all for sharing your time, your expertise with us this evening. Also expected this evening are Board of Supervisor members Andrews and Supervisor Malik of our Albemarle County Board of Supervisors. And also we're hoping that Delegate Sally Hudson will be with us this evening. All of the elected officials for being here. We may also have other elected officials who join us, as well as dozens of community members who are seated here in Lane Auditorium and watching live via Zoom. This is our first hybrid community event where people can participate in person and online in real time. We're excited about this opportunity, and we thank you for being willing to try this out with us tonight. Chris Simmons is running the show from the AV perspective, and we thank everyone for your patience because we may hit technical snags, but we know our IT folks will work with us to see us through, okay? This event was designed to help develop shared understanding of the impacts of climate change in our community, because knowing we face is the first step to plan for community resilience. The Albemarle County Board of Supervisors have climate change as a strategic priority for our community, and they've had that for several years now. It is amazing to see such community interest in this topic. As we look at where our climate impacts are and what our vulnerabilities will be, we know that we need everyone's participation and energy to meet these challenges and continue to be a vibrant community. This work is made possible through regional collaboration because climate risks do not stop or start at a county or municipal line. I want to thank the Piedmont Environmental Council for their leadership on the vulnerability report that we are here to learn more about today, as well as the City of Charlottesville and the University of Virginia for coordination on climate efforts. We have a packed program this evening, and now I'm going to ask Gabe Daly to come up and to please kick us off. Thank you very much again for your interest, your expertise, in giving us your time this evening. This is going to be an excellent evening. Thank you very much. Gabe?
Thank you so much, Mr. Richardson. Thank you all so much for coming out to be part of the event tonight. Hear our brief presentation from me and then hear the conversation with our panelists who are up here at the front. Really excited to talk with them about their experiences of this topic. And also thanks to everybody who's joining on Zoom online. We're really glad you could make it from your homes and participate in this important conversation. So again, my name is Gabe Daly. I'm the Climate Protection Program Manager for Albemarle County Local Government. And my role is spans a number of different projects and programs. Doing events like this is part of it. But I work on implementing our climate action plan and then also working on our process that we're developing for doing climate resilience planning. So I'll say a little bit more about that latter one in particular, focus of tonight's topic. So I'm gonna cover in my kind of intro presentation a few topics. Just want to give you a little bit of an overview of the climate vulnerability and risk assessment that is the basis for the conversation and that Mr. Richardson introduced at the beginning. You can see what the cover looks like here on the desk, and something you can find on our website to take more of a look at. Then we'll talk a little bit about a couple of different key themes within the report. So broadly speaking, it talks about changing temperatures and the different kinds of impacts that we're likely to face here in the county due to changing temperatures. And then we'll also talk a little bit about changing precipitation, kind of both of those being driven by climate change, and then each of them having different ripple effects for the local area, local community. And then I'll say briefly a little bit of how county staff plan to use the report. It's a lot of information. It's dense. It's quite technical. And so we've been pouring through it to think about how we can make use of this information in our next steps as local government staff and as we work with different community partners. All right, before I dive into some more information, I wanted to stop for a second because I had the opportunity earlier today to be at a conference for the Ravenna River Basin Commission and met a former county staff person named Dan Mahan, who worked in Parks and Recreation for many years. And Dan gave a little tour of a small section of trail along the Ravenna River in Dardentow Park. And he said that one of the things he's been doing since he retired from the county is working a lot in collaboration with different local community members on placemaking and on really helping folks in the area understand our place here and kind of develop more of a sense of place of where we are for each of us, different areas within the county that are might be important to us. So I wanted to just invite you to pause for a minute, and this might sound a little funny for a local government event, but just pause and maybe bring to mind a place in the county. Could be more specific than the county as a whole, but think about a particular area of the county that is important to you, that you care deeply about. You might have come here tonight with interest in kind of the technical topic and in hearing what our panelists have to say and in thinking about kind of the planning details and the policy implications. But I also wanted to remind us that I suspect that the reason many of you are here, if not all of you, certainly the reason I'm here, is at the core a deep care for place, for some place, all of the different aspects of it, the human parts, the cultural parts, the environmental parts, the natural ecosystem. So I think that's an important reminder. I know it is for me when I'm in the thick of things, working on a policy document or, reading up about the latest climate science, something like that. So the climate vulnerability and risk assessment is comprised of two companion documents. The assessment itself, you can see on the left side of the screen, is the more technical report that I just held up. And then we have a companion that's a 20-page summary with a little bit kind of more accessible visuals, graphics, the fonts even a little bigger just to make it less dense to read. And so we have a few of those actually up here to my left and right that you're welcome to come take a copy home with you. We have one copy of the technical report. Feel free to leaf through that at the end of the event. That one should probably stay here just because of the number of copies, but feel free to take a copy of the overview document that gives a little bit of a lighter entry into the topic, which can be dense. Although there's a lot of pages, a lot of charts and information in the report, it boils down to this chart that you can see on the screen. So essentially what the report is trying to do is it's taking science, taking data about the county and about what we know about climate change for this region, and then saying, how's that going to impact our local community? So the report looks at climate trends for the Virginia Piedmont through the years 2050 and 2075. And then it also looks at 5 specific hazards or sort of climate exacerbated hazards, you could say. So those are over my right shoulder, looking at extreme heat, drought, wildfire, extreme precipitation and flooding, and then pests and disease, both that can affect humans and also agriculture. So taking those hazards, all of which are things that we already experience in terms of weather events, but looking at how climate change will exacerbate them. And then saying, okay, so that's kind of what's coming from the sky, figuratively speaking. Well, how will that impact our particular community, which is unique and different than any other community? So looking at our specific watershed in the county, looking at the particular systems that we have of our economy, our built environment, and the people and where they're living here in the county. So it's making the connection between those trends and events that are exacerbated by climate change in terms of weather, and then our community and how those will interact. So I'll speak briefly, broadly again, like I said, about changing temperatures and changing precipitation, just as kind of two key areas to simplify it and sort of make sense of the information, and because of time. So this chart, some of you we're starting to see these a little bit more in pop culture, the kind of temperature bar charts. Often you see them more globally to illustrate the changing temperatures, rising temperatures over the last 100 years or so. What's important to note about this particular one, what's interesting, so this is from 1980 to 2021, and you'll notice that the red bars are getting more frequent and denser as we get closer and closer to 2020. So this is a historical trend of warming average temperatures in Albemarle County. And then the next slide shows future prediction. So it highlights ranges ending with 2050 and 2075. But you can see that trend is continuing in terms of increasing average temperatures for the county. I want to highlight two charts that are a little more detailed from the report, just because they're particularly interesting and noteworthy. So this one shows increasing numbers of days per year of days over 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's getting into the range of extreme heat, sometimes we call it, where you'll have heat advisories, where heat-related illness can happen. The two lines in this one, the two sets of data points, the darker color on the bottom is based on a lower emissions scenario. So that's if all of us and around the world can take really robust climate action to reduce emissions. Now we'd be looking more at the lower emissions scenario. And then the upper line and data set is a higher emissions scenario. So just wanted to share this with you to get a little bit more visual sense of some of what's in the technical report. And then this one I think is particularly interesting. We'll ask one of our panelists about a little bit later, is this actually looks at nighttime lows and the increasing numbers of days that we may experience. Actually, historically, we haven't experienced in the data that I've looked at, maybe one or two, but very rarely, if ever, nighttime lows that would be greater than 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And so this shows some increase of that, both for the low and particularly high emissions scenario. So just wanting to make it a little bit more concrete in terms of the kinds of data and information we looked at. And then this slide shows a number of the different kinds of implications that may mean. I won't go into detail on everything for the sake of time. You can see this in the shorter document that's up here, but looking at longer mosquito seasons, tick seasons, looking at kind of longer and more intense heat waves that can have impacts certainly on human health, but also affecting our local wildlife population, birds, as well as agriculture in the area. One example I wanted to show that's a map from the report that's helpful both to us as county staff and hopefully informative to other folks. This map shows two layers. So the dotted or dashed area is the urban heat island effect. So that's the idea that in urban areas where there's more concrete and pavement, less tree canopy and foliage, temperatures tend to be hotter. So this is a map of the generally where the heat island, this is actually future heat island in this map. And then the other layer is showing poverty levels by census tract in the county. So this kind of map will be useful for us as we think about moving into climate resilience planning, the different kinds of exposures and vulnerabilities that might exist in the county in terms of kind of these overlapping, the social conditions overlapped with the weather trends and events. Changing precipitation. A similar bar chart here. The one that's interesting with these lines in terms of the historical trend is you can see that there's a little bit more of a kind of ping-ponging back and forth between years that are above average and below average in terms of rainfall. And so one of the things that the vulnerability assessment showed is that we're likely to experience it becoming wetter and drier, which might sound counterintuitive. The way that works is we're expecting to see longer dry spells between rain events and then more intense precipitation, heavier rainfall when it does rain. And so we'll get into that a little bit with the panel discussion, but that has implications for flooding and drought, things like that. Overall, though, we do expect to see some increase in precipitation over the coming decades in the county. And I wanted to show this is a helpful map that's in the shorter summary of the report that shows floodplain currently and in the future in the county. So you can see a stream channel behind me, and then you can see where the current 100-year floodplain is. And then the upper line is where that 100-year floodplain will likely be in 2075. So 100-year flood is basically a flood that has 1% chance of happening in a given year. And so we're seeing with the different climate models and predictions that basically the level of flood that would happen that has a 1% chance of happening will become a bigger flood as we get into future decades. Again, some takeaways from the precipitation side of things, both the kind of drier spells and then also more intense precipitation you can see behind me, and feel free to take a look at this after the presentation. I'm going to skip the next slide because it's a little hard to see, but it's in my slides, which we can share afterwards. Just briefly how we'll use the report. Two main ways. So one, person that we had present at a prior event with the city and UVA back in January impressed upon everyone who was in attendance that the best climate resilience strategy, the best strategy for preparing for climate change is climate mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's number one, and we're continuing to implement the county's climate action plan that focuses on reducing emissions. But we also need to prepare for some of these increasingly intense storms, the longer, more intense heat waves, and some of the other implications that or impacts that we're expecting. So we're getting ready to launch a climate adaptation and resilience planning process. We're really excited about how we're building community engagement into that process. And we've had a lot of collaboration with the county's Office of Equity and Inclusion to be thinking about how we can center equity in that process. So we're excited about how it's shaping up. And that's something that we'll be launching in the next several months. The information in this report will be both helpful for community engagement, and it'll also be helpful for ultimately the plan, because it'll allow the strategies that we put into a climate resilience plan to be more data-driven, more project-based, and ultimately more effective. So that's it from me. Thanks so much for listening to that. Hopefully that was a helpful overview. We're going to do just a little bit of a set change for a couple minutes. I'll invite our panelists to come up and have a seat in the middle of 4 chairs, and we'll shuffle things and then shift to the conversation.
Test. Excellent. Well, as we get settled in here, we have something we wanted to try out with you all. Because this is our first time doing a hybrid event, we wanted to see if we could get everyone both in the audience and at home to work with us and do this Mentimeter. So if you want to take out your phone and or if you're at home on your computer, go ahead and use that QR code or go to www.menti.com, and there's a code there. And then we are going to have a question for you. Is everybody there? Go back. So the code is also at the top of each of the screens. I'm going to go to the next screen. And the question is, when you think about climate change affecting our community, what top 3 words come to mind? And I think when you start to answer, they will show up. So the code is at the top, 2691479. Oh, look at that. Scary. I see scary, extreme, housing, heartbreaking. Thank you for doing this. By the way, I'm Serena Guria. I'm the community engagement coordinator here at Albemarle County. And we're so glad to have you. And we didn't introduce Nicole Jones, who's in the back running the Zoom for us and doing all the smart technical stuff. All right, excellent. So I think you can continue to do this. I'm going to go to the next one just for time. The next question is, in one word or phrase, what is most important for us to prioritize as we build resilience to the impacts of climate change? We have some like-minded folks thinking about equity, climate justice and equity. Amazing. Decarbonization, the most vulnerable. Thank you. Well, that was a little warm up. We're going to use this as our audience Q&A later. So anyone at home, we're going to go to this next slide and here in the audience. If you have a question for our panel, we're going to go, we'll drop this for a second, but you can ask questions here and you can actually upvote. So if you have a similar question, you can just click on that thumbs up at home or on your phone and we'll elevate that question. All right. So we'll do a quick introduction and then we'll get into the conversation. So first we have Karen DeCardenas, and she is a graduate student at UVA studying civil engineering and urban and environmental planning. Her focus is on sustainable and resilient transportation systems. Before starting graduate school, she worked at the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission on bike and pedestrian planning for the region, as well as for Bel Air Farm, a local organic farm in Albemarle County. This past summer, she interned at Piedmont Environmental Council as a climate fellow intern. Welcome, Corinne. Next, we have Brian Morse, who's a wildlife biologist, ecologist, and co-founder of the Virginia Forestry and Wildlife Group, a natural resource management company based in Albemarle County. He received his bachelor's degree in fisheries and wildlife science from North Carolina State University and a master's degree from the University of Georgia, Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources, with a concentration in wildlife management and ecology. Brian's broad interests have allowed him to work promoting biodiversity and habitat through the southeastern United States, from coastal barrier islands and Piedmont prairies to Appalachian mountain forests. Through his work with pollinator habitats, Brian has become involved with local efforts to support both native and honeybee populations. Brian lives near Batesville in western Albemarle County with his wife, son, and lots of great wildlife. Next, we'll have Deputy Chief Emily Palicha. She's worked in public safety for almost 30 years as a firefighter, paramedic, emergency manager, and chief officer, currently serving as Deputy Chief of Community Risk and Resilience for Albemarle County Fire Rescue. She recently completed a master's degree at the Naval Postgraduate School, where her research was focused on early identification of risks and hazards and the development of upstream strategies to mitigate the collective impact on public health and safety. Oh. And finally, we have Dr. Irene Mathieu, a pediatrician and public health researcher at UVA, where she is an assistant director of the Center for Health Humanities and Ethics. Dr. Mathieu serves on the steering committee of the Virginia Clinicians for Climate Action. She is also a writer of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, and has been called an eco-poet for her creative work related to the climate crisis. A mother, amateur chef, hiker, and swimmer, Dr. Mathieu spent much of her childhood in Albemarle County. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Oh, that's a lot of credentials. Oh my goodness. Okay. So first we have a question for all of you. And maybe Corinne, I'll start with you. What brought you to focusing your attention on this work?
Yeah, I think like in my lifetime, there's never really been a point when the environment and climate wasn't of importance. And so I really don't remember a time that it wasn't kind of on my mind. I was watching documentaries about climate change in elementary school. And so it's kind of been a gradual process from that, but it's always been a passion of mine. And I think, yeah, I kind of got into transportation because I really think transportation is one of the biggest emission contributors to greenhouse emissions. And I think we can improve, if we can improve that and build a system that is that really works for everybody, that it doesn't really have to be about, like, sustainable living doesn't really have to be this like trade-off between how like a livable community and sustainable community. So that's kind of what got me into that. And just some of my experiences going through working at the farm, I saw the effect that the water and changing weather patterns really had on that. And it's just these basic necessities that really is so important. And so yeah, I'm still definitely working my way through learning all the things, but I just, yeah, my whole life I've been very aware, I think, about how important the climate really is.
Thank you. Can you all hear? Is it easy to hear? Oh, maybe just bring the mic a little bit closer to your face. Yes. Okay, Brian.
Is the microphone working now? Okay, great. Well, we're good. Okay. I too started from a very young age being immersed in nature and kind of falling in love with it. I was the quintessential kid that would bring the snake home, much to my mother's consternation. And I never kind of lost that sense of wonder being out in the wilds. And when it came time to pick a career and choose a path, I decided to stick with what I knew and what I loved, and maintain that through my education. And then after that, staying in the natural resources and conservation, and trying to do something a little bit better for the planet and bring back our native ecosystems. And I think another important part of my passion and what I'm trying to project out into the world is to also make people aware of nature and how we're an integral part of that, and how they can appreciate it and love it and respect it, and how it can bring benefits back to us beyond just simple physiological needs, but also psychological needs and spiritual needs as well.
Can you? Okay. So I also grew up playing in creeks and outdoors. I grew up in Charlottesville, and there was a creek I used to go play in near my house, and I was outside all the time and scratched up. But interestingly, I think I have a different, having been in public safety, I always sort of thought of the environment and the changing climate change and everything as somebody else's problem, quite honestly, and didn't see it. We deal so much in human crises and human tragedy and the impact of whatever circumstance or whatever emergency someone is experiencing, that the environment and climate change has always been there, but it's been so far removed from the immediate, which is what we deal in public safety. And it wasn't until probably 10 years ago that it became more of a it got more prominence in the world of public safety, and before that, but and certainly out west, you know, I remember early in my career as a firefighter, the Virginia Department of Forestry was offering a red card class and training to get your red card, and I knew that you know, wildland firefighters had their red cards, and I was like, well, I want one of those. I'm going to go to this training. And I went to this whole training and learned how to, you know, deploy the shelter and do all this. And then I went to work for the city of Charlottesville and realized that we don't fight wildfires. And so I got my red card and never saw a wildfire for 28 years, and then retired. But I did go out in the county on some brush fires and some small wildfires, and started thinking more about that. So it's been there, but it's been this sort of removed, distant concept. It's conceptual, right? When you're in a business like public safety, where you're dealing in, you know, the present and the impact of the present, it isn't until you start sort of pulling that apart and teasing out cause that you start to realize that it's a force multiplier and it's there. And I think we'll get more into that. So I won't go too far down that road, but.
Thanks. So like Emily and Brian, I was one of those kids who was out in the backyard and in my home in Albemarle County in the woods, constantly running around. No television in my house, so it was before any other screen. So that was my safe place, my fun place. And for me, I think my interest in this issue really came about through my poetry and my creative work. I didn't realize that I was writing about this until a colleague of mine said, "Oh, you're an eco poet." And I was like, "I am? Okay. I don't know what that is, but I guess I am writing a lot about these emotions and experiences that are coming up around, being in the middle of a climate crisis." And I started thinking about what I could do, and writing poetry and creative work is very important, but I started to think about what else I could do as an advocate, maybe a little more publicly. And I thought that utilizing my background as a physician, and specifically pediatrician, was a really important and meaningful way to tackle this issue. So I got involved with Virginia Clinicians for Climate Action, which is a statewide organization. And I'm doing my master's degree now and in public health, and I've been doing a lot of coursework on climate change. And so I really kind of look at it as we all have a part to play, and it's about figuring out what we're passionate about, what our interest and our skill set is, and then picking just that one thing, that one area or issue that we can tackle and try to make a difference on. So that's how I came to this.
That's so interesting that you all essentially started off in play and nature and then came to it in different ways, which is I think we can all identify with that. So getting to the report. So despite our best intentions to make it as tangible as possible, the results of the report can seem really big and abstract. From your vantage point, what are you observing with respect to climate change impacts and how folks in your field are preparing for them? Maybe Iren, we'll start with you.
Sure. So in my field, I think the biggest changes I've seen are around medical education. I'm seeing increasingly medical students and also other health profession students like nursing students who are very passionate and interested about this. And like Karine verbalized earlier, who have grown up with this crisis. We're seeing this generation of people where it's never not been an issue. And so those students are really leading the push for increased education around the health effects of the climate crisis. So I think education is the biggest area where I'm seeing some changes, but certainly we see it clinically. I think we'll talk more about that later, but it's becoming increasingly evident that we can't ignore the health effects of the climate crisis.
So I think I started to go down the path of the force multiplier, and for emergency services, it is a theme or a concept that's there that I started really recognizing when I was doing work for an accreditation process and looking at a lot of the data of our calls and the call types we run, and then I started realizing that we were looking at some demographic data as well, and I started realizing that we were running more types of calls where there were these heat islands. We had done some analysis and realized that there were the neighborhoods without tree canopy. We went there more often, and for either mental health problems or respiratory problems or overheating or a number of types of calls, but there were more calls. And that didn't seem like that was just a coincidence. So that's when I really became aware. And that was, like I said, probably 10 years ago when I started really recognizing that there is a direct impact. It isn't so far removed that making a change doesn't make a difference. It really does. Planting a tree really does. I mean, I remember growing up as a little kid and, people would say, well, we'll plant a tree to offset this. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. That's not really going to make a difference. But when you actually start seeing where not having, a tree to seek respite in the middle of the summer, and or even these construction sites where the workers take a break at lunch and they go, there's nowhere for them to sit in the shade. And then we're going out there in the afternoon because they're suddenly dehydrated because they couldn't get a break and just sit under a tree. So, I mean, it's so simple, but those were the kinds of impacts that I think I've seen, and that's how it impacts us. There's some other specific ones, but those are these sort of, in a broad sense, it's a multiplier and it adds on to the types of calls.
That makes me think of the exercise that we did when Gabe started his introduction. I can't imagine that anyone thought of a parking lot as their place for where they go to like their special place in Albemarle County. So that just goes to the point of
Exactly.
where we think of as like peaceful and calm places.
Well, I guess one of the big things that I get to see firsthand every day is a little more in the trenches of the environment, being out in the woods and in the forests and on the rivers. And you know, we humans have this big brain and this ability to kind of change ourselves or our environment slightly for comfort. So we're hot, let's flick on the air conditioning. We're cold, fire up the heater. I don't want to walk down the street. I'll get in my car and drive down the street. But the rest of the world that we live in, that we are actually still a part of, the deer, the butterflies, the flowers, the trees, they don't have that ability. And so they are seeing, and that part of our world are seeing the impacts, and we're just skimming the surface on what that means. And when I drive down the road, I unfortunately can identify that invasive plant or the ash trees that are now dead, and it pops out right to me. And so that's folks like myself and in our profession, we're seeing that kind of unraveling of our ecosystems and those big dramatic land changes really coming to a crisis level.
Yeah, I think, oh yeah, sorry. Won't do that a second time. I think that kind of the thing that pops into my head the most is working at Bel Air Farm. Just seeing how hard the weather patterns really made farming in the area was really, it's hard to ignore when you're out there dealing with it. That I think a lot of times it's easy to forget when you get your food from the grocery store and you're not out there. And the heat as well, like, you know, the report talks about loss of productivity because of higher weather patterns or higher weather temperatures, and that people can't be out there doing that. And it's hard work being out there and being outside all day in the heat, harvesting and bringing food to people. And it's a really important, you know, food source to have. But, you know, if it keeps getting hotter and hotter, it's going to be really hard to do that. And with water management, you know, we had last summer when I was working with them, we had weeks without really any kind of actual rainfall on the farm, and they had to recreate the whole water management system on the farm to pull up the water from the little creek. And they're like, well, we're lucky that we have this creek running through that we can like at least get the water from there. So that I think was really interesting to see. And then on the transportation side, you know, there's definitely a big stress, and the report talks about this as well, like the stress that goes on the materials for transportation systems, and how, you know, we haven't really been building these systems for the changing temperatures. So as that occurs, you know, transportation, I think, is oftentimes something people take for granted. But if we can't really get to all of the necessities we need to live our daily lives, it's not going to be fun. So yeah, I think there's lots of research going out there about materials, how to create more sustainable systems, more resilient. So people are working on it, but that's definitely kind of the things that pop into mind the most.
Serena, could we just for time, I want to make sure we have some time to get to the ending questions. Could we skip the next one? The one that was for me, that was for everybody, and maybe just kind of dive into some particular questions?
Sure. Just that made me think of, like, that's 4 perspectives, but there's so many more perspectives that we need to, when I think of like farm workers, I wouldn't have necessarily thought of that. And that's why it's so important for so many different people and to have different experiences to come to this conversation, so that those experiences can be represented and that we can really understand the complexity and the intricacy of the issue that we're facing. All right, Corinne, I'm going to put you on the spot again. The report predicts impacts for 2 time horizons, 2050 and 2075. 2075 feels really far away to me, and yet it's most likely in your lifetime. What predictions and impacts stand out to you from the report, and how do you anticipate these affecting your life if we stay on trend?
Yeah, I think it will affect me in a lot of ways because, yeah, 2075, I would still be younger than my grandparents are now. So it's definitely, oh, sorry. I feel like I'm getting too close and then, okay. So yeah, 2075, all these, yeah, when you're looking through the report, you're like, oh, that seems, we don't want to get there, but that definitely is something that I'd experience if we don't really change course and really take action soon. It's, the changes we make now can really impact how, kind of reduce the intensity that myself and future generations will experience down the road. I think, yeah, all the things we're talking about are very basic necessities that we really are going to affect our life in many, many ways. I need water, clean water. I need food. I need, and all these little changes are really going to add up and not be a really a very livable situation. I think, some of the things that really struck me were it's more of a personal thing, but the tick and pests that were brought up, that's something that I was diagnosed with Lyme disease my senior year of college. My mom and my sister have both had it for years without knowing, and it's a really debilitating disease. So the fact that there's going to be more days there, that's not something that's, I don't want to be 80 living with Lyme disease, and so all of those, if it gets more and more intense, I think it's really going to be a really hard world to live in. And it's not just something we can brush off.
Thanks, Corinne. Irene, the report predicts, like I mentioned earlier, kind of longer, more intense heat waves. And I actually showed the chart of the increase in nighttime temperature minimums, which we don't necessarily, or folks might not think about immediately when someone says, oh, there's going to be a heat wave. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit from your perspective as a clinician, also pediatrician, kind of what comes to mind when you think about your field and how folks like yourself will be, responding to different kinds of health issues, both in terms of heat waves in general, but also this interesting statistic around, or this trend around nighttime lows being hot.
Yeah, thank you, Gabe. So the interesting thing about nighttime lows is that, nighttime, of course, what we do is we sleep, and sleep is incredibly important for the human body for a variety of processes that can only occur when we're asleep. In general, we use sleep to heal physiological and psychological stress to our bodies. So when we're in the middle of a heat wave and it's 95 degrees outside, our bodies are under a lot of stress. And so when we are dealing with that stress during the day, at night, it's really important for us to be able to reset and to heal the negative effects on the human body of that kind of stress. So what we see when we have these heat waves where there are both high daytime highs as well as high nighttime lows, the body is not able to take a break from trying so hard to maintain a normal internal body temperature to be able to do that work of undoing all that stress. And it continues to be stressed out overnight, just like during the day. And so that leads to this compounding effect of stress, which can really cause health problems like dehydration, heat stroke, and other forms of heat illness, even mortality. And we know that the very youngest and the very oldest, as well as people with chronic conditions, are more likely to experience this. There's some interesting data about things like heart disease and high blood pressure, and how, not having a chance for your body to just relax and rest in a cooler temperature at night can worsen these conditions and can really lead to significant illness. Like Emily was talking about, making these house calls to folks who were having health crises. We know it impacts human behavior. So when you're not able to psychologically sort of cool down, that's why we say, people are upset, they need to cool off. Literally, our body does cool down at night. And when we sleep well in a cool environment, we're able to deal with negative emotions during our sleep. So we don't have that opportunity. We actually see from the data that in places where there are heat islands, where the temperature doesn't cool off adequately, there is an increase in violent behavior. There's an increase in anger and psychological difficulties and psychiatric emergencies. So there are a lot of downstream effects I could talk about, but I think This goes back to the equity issue. When we think about who's in the heat islands, who are those most vulnerable, younger and older populations, the people without air conditioning who don't have the option to turn their thermostat down to 70 when our nighttime lows are now 80 or 85 degrees a few years from now. So it's a really important issue.
Thank you. Serena.
Emily, this question's for you. The report predicts increasing likelihood of drought and wildfire in the coming decades. Although we're not likely to experience these phenomena as intensely as the western half of the country, we do need to take this increased risk seriously. As a deputy chief in our fire rescue department, what jumps out to you as particularly important?
Yeah, I think I mentioned that, we don't have these huge wildfires like they do in the West, thank goodness. But what we do see a lot of are wind-driven fires. And so we see that even in densely populated areas. The winds are stronger. And that's what's contributing to a lot of the severity of the fires, the wildfires. So where there might just be a small brush fire in the county, it becomes a much bigger. We're seeing, the accentuation of what would normally be a smaller brush fire becomes bigger, quicker. And the same is true with structure fires, which is more common in this area, structural firefighting versus wildland firefighting. We're seeing, and some of that has to do with the materials, the building construction materials, when less expensive siding is used and it's burning. If there's winds, the wind will make it'll burn hotter and faster, and it will spread more easily. And we see that a lot in the densely populated parts of the city and the county, where the house next door will suddenly have their siding on fire, and then that spreads if we can't contain it. So for us, the window of firefighting has gotten much shorter. To make a difference, we've got to get there faster and take action quicker in a more sort of aggressive way. Otherwise, it's going to get ahead of us. And that's the difference in that I've seen in my career, is that, old building construction, heavy timber takes longer. It just didn't catch and burn as fast. And so now there's about 8 to 10 minutes before it's truly ahead of us. And that sounds like a really short window of time, and it is, especially if you live, far out and know where your fire stations are. It's very hard for us to get there and get there in time to make the difference that's needed. And we can, but it requires being very focused. There's a hyper focus on the strategies and tactics that didn't exist when I first started. And the sophistication of the industry has dramatically shifted. The other thing I'll say about wildfires, it's in the report, and it's very big topic in the fire service, is wildland urban interface. In fact, in the fire service, they even say WUI with the acronym. It's this idea that we're going into the woods and we're clearing just a little tiny piece of property to build a house because we want to be in the middle of nature, but then we don't do a good enough job of clearing enough around us. And we're going to go do something stupid as a human and then set the woods on fire. And we see it. I'll tell you, one of the most common ones we see is people having a nice fire in their fireplace. And then they put the ashes in a can, and they'll take the can out, and they don't pay close enough attention to what they're putting the can on, or, and then the can, hot embers, they've tried to contain it, they've tried to be responsible, but then something happens, or it gets knocked over by, an animal or something. So that idea that you haven't built a buffer around your home, that's what that wildland urban interface concept. And they preach this in the West, and they have legislation around it, and really quick story, the house behind me in Belmont sold recently, and a young couple from California bought it. And they, a few weeks ago, they came here and they rented a backhoe, and it was a young couple, and I'm like watching them, and he's got and they're scientists that work in labs, but he's out there on this backhoe they got a dumpster, and they're clearing all these like brush, shrub trees they're mostly weeds. And they cleared a lot of property. And I go over there and and they've got on the proper gear. They have chainsaws, they have everything. And I'm like, you guys are so well equipped. And they're like, well, we have to do this, right? And I'm like, what do you mean you have to do this? And they're like, somebody will come around, right, and say something, because all that is overgrowth that needs to be cleared. And I'm like, no one's going to come tell you have to clear that. And they thought, because it's so ingrained in that culture out there, it's so ingrained in their culture that you take care of the land around you. Don't let the invasive stuff get away from you. Don't let, you really protect. If you want to live out in the woods, you have to protect it. And that wildland urban interface is becoming more of an issue in the county. I do see that in Albemarle County starting to be a bit of an issue, is making sure we have good clearance and good space around structures. You probably see it a lot more than I do, even. I would just.
Yeah, I'd like you, if I can take just a second to stay on that theme, because I think there's an interesting part if you read through the technical document, is that everything is connected in there in one way or another. These different topics are not isolated. They all kind of come together and are interconnected. And fire is a really interesting example of that, in that one of the tools that we've had in this country for millennium is using fire on the landscape to achieve a lot of different objectives, whether that's pest management or fuel control or wildlife habitat. And that changed pretty dramatically after, Western colonization of the United States. But today it is still a tool that is often talked about in ecological restoration, is the use of prescribed fire to reduce fuel loads. And it's kind of a romantic vision to use it, because it's becoming increasingly more and more challenging to even use that tool at all, because of more houses, more infrastructure, more air quality issues. But I've been doing some projects this summer in areas in the national forest that have been burned repeatedly, and I've spent hours and hours in really dense vegetation and have come out with 0 ticks on me at all. And I can walk through my backyard and be covered in ticks. And so using tools like that for tick management, for reduced fuel loads, to reduce the wildland fire interface, they're there, but it's becoming harder. And all of these climate issues, drought leading to drier fuels, more pests like the emerald ash borer killing our ash trees, creating a lot of dead fuel on the landscape. These are all topics that are connected.
But you can't use that tool because people are building houses
Exactly.
to be more remote,
Right.
It's tough.
Just to the next question, to kind of stick with Brian and Emily for a minute, we had sort of a joint question for each of you. So the report also predicts longer dry spells with more intense rainfall and potential flooding kind of interspersed in between those. And we were curious, Brian, if you might talk a little bit about the implications of that from an ecological perspective, impact on habitat, pollinators, and then Emily, kind of your perspective on that from an emergency response. You think about responding to intense rain and flooding events.
Sure. I mean, one direct implication is that we're out there trying to promote a healthier ecosystem. There are lots of organizations and state agencies and contractors that are planting hundreds and hundreds of trees by streams and planting more resilient habitats, but that's becoming more and more challenging with a flooding event. So imagine planting hundreds of trees along a stream or a river like the Ravenna, and then we have a year like 2018 where we get 27 inches above rainfall, and we have the flooding events that jump the banks because the creeks, the stream channels are heavily eroded. They're not as protected as they used to be, and they wash all those recently planted trees, downstream. That's all gone now. or we're trying to build better, more resilient ecosystems, but we have a drought every other year. So there are a lot of challenges just simply trying to get some of that conservation work on the ground. Not to mention all of the other challenges to our local ecosystems that this inconsistent and more dramatic climatic conditions are putting the stress on. So oak trees are a good example. You know, we've lost chestnuts, we've lost hemlock, we've lost ash. Oak trees are kind of what everybody thinks of as that resilient, very beneficial tree, but we're starting to see something called oak decline, where our red oaks, white oaks are just kind of mysteriously dying and dropping off, not from one particular disease, but from a whole host of stresses. It's way too rainy this year. Then there's a drought. We have mild winters. So the pests that will negatively impact the tree grow in numbers. They're not checked by our colder winters. And eventually the tree, just like a human body, is just too much stress and it gives out. That's it, Denmark.
The question for me is the impact of that the flooding and the I mean, I think everybody's watching the news right now, and Ian. So the obvious is people getting stuck and getting flooded out of their homes and their roads and their ability to get where they need to go, to do essential services, to do you know, to keep priorities like hospitals and things like that open. It's becoming increasingly more challenging. In Albemarle County, there are some, you know, there's some areas that we've identified, and there's some efforts to remediate and fix areas that are prone to flooding. But like, you know, on a very small scale, even going into this weekend, I know of, you know, 3 places where we'll make sure we put barriers up so that people don't drive into high water. And it's what's become challenging that wasn't that way 20 years ago for us was the impact. The depth of the water has gotten higher when we have these dramatic floods and these dramatic rains. There are areas we can't even go into sometimes, or the winds will be so high we actually don't respond when it's past a certain mile per hour, and you know, that's shocking. I think if you think about it, if you call 911 and aren't going to get a response because the winds are so dangerous, we shouldn't be out there either. That's a really scary thing to start thinking about. And I think if you're watching the news the last couple of days, Florida's saying that. They're telling their people, like, you're basically taking that risk, and it's about managing the risk. But for a lot of people, they don't have the option. And the thing we see always is you can't I mean, you can try to tell people to evacuate, but it's very hard to have shelters where animals can be taken, domestic pets. So most people with a pet aren't going to leave their home. They know that. They know they can't take their pet, and they're not going to leave their pet behind. And I don't blame them. I have 2 dogs and a cat. I wouldn't leave. So that's where it's becoming increasingly more difficult. And I think we'll talk about ways in which people can be more prepared, but it's gonna take a concerted effort at the individual level for all of these things. As Brian said, I mean, for all of the collective impact is really what's profound of this report, I think. And it's really that recognition that it does take everybody's effort to do something and to fix this problem. It's not gonna fix with just the nature guy worrying about it, or, you know, we've all gotta figure out our part and do it.
I'm going to go off script here for a second, and that all makes me think about we have our individual part to do, but there's also land use planning and how we see land use in the future. So Gabe, I have a question for you. What is your role, and what is the role of this conversation when we think about the comprehensive plan update and how we think about land use planning for the next 20 years?
That's a great question.
Totally on the spot.
Yeah,
Sorry.
sure. Thank you. So what I'll say for now, just to be brief, and there will be more community conversations about this. But the Board of Supervisors has been very emphatic, has, I think, taken a really strong leadership stance in asking staff to look at the comprehensive plan update that's happening through a lens of equity and also a lens of climate change / climate action. So that's been really great to see. And because of that, I've had the opportunity to work with colleagues in our Office of Equity and Inclusion on creating a tool that in the near term can be helpful for the folks in the planning department who are directly responsible for that comprehensive plan update. Creating a tool for them to be able to use to kind of look at different land use decisions, different kinds of policies that will go into the comp plan update through an equity lens, through a climate lens, and to get a sense of, you know, where might this policy end up? What are some of the effects or implications that you might not think of at first glance? So that's important work. And we also hope that tool will be able to be useful beyond just the comprehensive plan, something that folks in Albemarle County local government can use for other kinds of programs or policies that might be being considered for design or implementation in the community.
Well done. Now back to the script. Irene and Brian. The report's final chapter predicts increasing spread of invasive plants and insect pests that can impact wild habitats, agriculture, and human health. What are you observing now in your respective fields, and how can we better prepare for the future? Irene?
Sure. I mean, one major thing I see a lot, especially in primary care pediatrics, is tick-borne illness. So like Karine brought up, Lyme disease. That's the major one we think about in this area, but we still do have others like Rocky Mountain spotted fever, ehrlichiosis, alpha-gal I'm seeing increasingly. And we saw on that slide earlier that you showed, Gabe, that we have more and more days of the year when ticks are active. And to me, I mean, this is a really important sort of warning that we all need to think about when we go outside and we spend time, you know, in the outdoors. But I think it's a great example also of, so there was one graph I really loved on page 17 of the report that shows the Venn diagram of adaptation and mitigation. And what I loved is that center overlap, which demonstrated that although we sort of often think of those as two separate things or somehow in opposition, there are a lot of adaptation strategies that also will mitigate climate change because they will decrease emissions in and of themselves. And I think tick-borne illness is an example that you may not think of that actually is a perfect example. So one thing I learned in my MPH coursework is that one of the reasons we're seeing increased transmission of these diseases is not only that ticks are active for longer in the year, but it's about our land use. And it's about the fact that in suburban areas, like many parts of the county, we have large encroachments of developments, human developments that are creating smaller and smaller wildlife corridors. And so that's causing a lot of the mammals like deer and mice that are part of that tick life cycle to be in closer contact with one another. So they're starting to seeing increase in transmission of Lyme disease among the deer and the ticks and the mice that form this cycle. So more of the ticks actually have Lyme disease than they did 50 or 100 years ago because all of the animals are crammed together, transmitting the disease among each other more. So if we think about land use, you know, how can we plan for an Albemarle County where there are larger swaths of environment for animals to roam about more freely and spread out as they used to be, which would decrease the transmission of tick-borne illness and also would decrease the climate crisis in and of itself because we're increasing our carbon sinks and our tree canopies. We're not taking away those carbon sequesterers, trees and large plants. So all of these things are interconnected. And I think that's just one example of something I see clinically that has much bigger implications for both mitigation and adaptation.
Yeah, I completely agree. The cycle of deer and mice and ticks is a complicated problem that we're exasperating. We have more deer on the landscape. We have less land in these suburban areas that are perfect deer habitats. So we've taken away all the predators. There's less hunting. There's no mountain lions anymore. We've fed them all these great nursery grown plants and given them kind of their perfect little edge habitat. And we're seeing these explosions in populations of all that Lyme vector and disease vector cycle. To me, it's kind of sad that the scariest, deadliest thing walking through the woods is a small little arachnid. Like, give me a mountain lion attacking me if I'm going to go out. But yeah, that's another wildlife disease issue that we're seeing that people are kind of scratching their heads at a little bit. And scratching is a little bit of a pun on this one. Mange. I'm in the western part of the county, and there's a lot of issues with bears coming out of the park. They're coming down to places like Crozet, even Batesville. There's a lot more people, so that's a lot more trash. Bears are congregating, they're getting around each other, and they're spreading mange. And there's some studies that are linking climate change, landscape level change to this mange in bears. So.
Thank you. Thanks all for that piece. So we want to transition. One thing I should say is the county also, many of you may already know this, but the county has a biodiversity action plan that has a lot of strategies that work hand in hand with the climate action plan. So to this issue that Ren and Brian both brought up around wildlife habitat, wildlife corridors. We want to transition a little bit. We know the topic can be a downer. It can be scary. It can feel overwhelming. Part of our intention was wanting to really, make the report kind of more accessible and understandable because it's quite technical. But we want to also transition a little bit to thinking about some of the things that we can do, some of what we can, where we can take action. So thinking of the time, I'm going to start with kind of go a little off script and out of order with our final questions. That's okay, Serena. So first, I'd like to ask folks, if you could picture yourself in Albemarle County in 20 years from now, the county having worked in collaboration with the community. I didn't send you this question in advance. So your spontaneous answer is good. So after the community has taken bold action to build resilience to the impacts of climate change. So 20 years from now, let's say you're still living in the county. We've really done good work in partnership as a community, as a local government. What do you see? Maybe Ren, start with you and we can go down.
Gosh. Well, first of all, I see more areas where wildlife can live and habitats that are appropriate for them. I see the return of species that have maybe been pushed out or are not thriving right now. And in the places where humans live, I see smarter transportation and smarter urban development that allows people to maybe designed by Corinne, that allows people to get to where they need to go with without using fossil fuels, without an addiction to fossil fuel, and create spaces that are safe where we don't have a trade-off of if you're going to be in an urban area, you deal with air pollution and traffic and all these other things. Very broad, I know, but
that's fine.
I'm going to go even more broad by saying you don't see this, but a consciousness. I think a consciousness that's across all of the community members. I think one thing, I know this has been, it's a heavy topic and it can be a downer, but if there was one of the number of good things that came out of COVID was that it has taught us how to be, it's taught us that interconnectedness. It's taught us that public health is weaved throughout everything we do in government and should be. It's taught us that this collective impact concept and how can we get further upstream and look at ways in which we can do the adaptive and mitigative measures. But I think just at an individual level, it's that consciousness, it's that understanding what we can do individually and how we have a place and we play a role and we're responsible for ourselves and our environment and our well-being. And we don't think about it that way. I think we think, there is something else. Just like I thought early in my career, it was somebody else's problem. It was somebody else's, I didn't think I could have an impact on, but I know now we do, we all do. It is a big, and preparedness on a granular level for the flooding this weekend, knowing That running out on Saturday morning to do your grocery shopping is probably not your best plan, right? And buying up all the water and toilet paper and whatever else is probably not the best plan. So.
Brian, what do you envision?
Well, I think if Albemarle County can get this right in 20 years, I would love to see a very happy and confident society that is harmonious in our beautiful county. So in this era of kind of distrust and misunderstanding and across all aspects, it would be really nice if we weren't stressed and frustrated sitting in traffic, or not having the shade that we need to stay cool, or going to a park and it's just being full of invasives and wildfire fear and tick fear. So I think if the action plan and we can steer the ship back in the right direction, I think society would just be happier and healthier and friendlier.
That's great. Corinne?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to mirror a lot of this similar things, but transport, of course, is kind of one of the things that pops into my head the most. And I think Charlottesville and Albemarle have a lot of potential to create a system that works for everyone, and that where mobility really we can have a system that works for everybody. I think a lot of times we're still working with equity with land use and transportation. So ideally, I think if we can really, it's hard to separate equity from climate action, and how can we do some of these land use processes that can really account for all of that, and have transportation systems that are resilient, but that where people aren't having to sit in a car, that there's active mobility where people can get around town with a bike or just walking, or not having to spend so much time on that. And then, I think just I hope that people really get it in 20 years, that people are on board, that we value the environment as much as any kind of financial thing. I think those are kind of my main things.
So we have two questions that have come in from the Mentimeter, and just to piggyback on what Corinne was just saying, one of the questions is, are there plans to make the county more bike and pedestrian friendly and less automobile intensive? So unfortunately, we don't have a transportation planner here with us today, but I don't know, Gabe or Emily, if you could speak to that from the county's perspective.
I could speak to, thanks for the question. So I could speak to one aspect of it that was a kind of delightful news for me to hear. That's a small piece of the puzzle. So I used to live in the city, and in June, my wife and I moved to the Mill Creek subdivision area down south on Avon. And several weeks ago, started seeing transportation kind of construction cones, heavy equipment on the east side of Avon by where the Food Lion is, going south several blocks towards Mountain View, and then north a little ways. And I was, wondering, oh, what's going on here? There's going to be some new construction. It looked like it was going to be somewhat road related or transportation related work. And there was part of me that was almost too afraid to ask, because I was thinking, oh, maybe it's just like a utility line, like someone's updating, the cable network or something like that. But I asked our deputy chief of transportation in facilities and environmental services. I said, hey, what's going on there? Is it is it a utility? And he said, nope, it's going to be a shared use path. So it's, it runs the exact distance. I don't know. It'll connect the kind of Mill Creek subdivision area to Mountain View Elementary School, where a lot of folks go to elementary school in that area. So maybe make it somewhat easier for young students to walk to school. We'll see kind of ultimately what happens. I thought about it as, okay, another piece in the puzzle that might allow me to bike to work from there. I used to bike to work sometimes from where I lived in the city. So there's pieces, and I know from transportation planning office here, as well as the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission. They've been applying for quite a number of grants to help them fund further work to kind of fill in the puzzle pieces of that more bike and pedestrian friendly neighborhood that helps folks not have to necessarily be stuck in traffic. So that was kind of personal experience, but it was nice to see that kind of with my own eyes where I live.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still really new to the county as an employee, only a couple months now, but in that short time, I've been part of a group that's looking at all the grants that are happening. And one of them that the county recently got was to study pedestrian and bike possibilities on the 29 corridor from hydraulic out, which, I mean, that seems crazy to think that somebody can cross that as a street, right? So, but they're aggressively looking at those areas. And what was really fascinating to me is that it is, from what what I'm taking in is that it's the catalyst for that is both environmental and quality of life. And safety it is part of it, but that wasn't what was driving it. It was this idea that we can reduce the number of vehicles. We can reduce. So it's gives me great hope that that's what's driving it, and not looking at the aftermath, which is we're always we're not getting far enough upstream. And so it's hopeful that we're really looking at trying to be as upstream as possible is what I'm seeing already.
And I'll just put in a quick plug. If pedestrian and bike connectivity is important to you, we still have the comprehensive plan update process. So if that is a thing that you want to bring to the table, then I encourage you to definitely play a role in that conversation. It's going to be a project that's going on for the next 2 years. And there's a lot of prioritization around connectivity. So please come and participate in that work. Gabe, we have another question that came in on the Mentimeter. And Nicole, if we could put up that slide with the Mentimeter questions, that would be great. So Gabe, for you, how do you plan to use the recently published report in your work? What parts of it do you see as a more immediate application in how you will plan future work?
Great question. So it gets back a little bit to something I briefly spoke to at the end of the slideshow at the beginning. But one of the aspects of the report that is particularly useful to us as staff and thinking about our planning is the way in which the data around kind of socioeconomic conditions in the community intersect with the prediction around trends and events with respect to the weather and the climate exacerbated hazards. So that being so, like that map that I shared that shows the overlap of where the urban heat island is, and then where a kind of aggregate score of a number of different indicators associated with poverty, income level are distributed across the county. When we look at that together, it helps give us some idea around our community engagement. And so one of the things we're excited with community engagement for the climate resilience planning process is coming at it from a number of different angles. So, having more events like this, having kind of broad, open events, public comment for lots of folks, but we also want to make sure that we're using the information from the report to do some more targeted and direct outreach where we're noticing that there's greater exposure or greater vulnerability to a particular climate hazard that might interact with socioeconomic conditions in that area. So kind of using those in conversation with each other and then helping that drive some of the outreach and engagement that we do.
Do we have any questions? Oh, do you want if you're not using the Mentimeter, you could just come on up and we'll get a mic. Yeah.
So I'm a green granny of Charlottesville, and the reason we have gotten active for 8 years in the community is this is heavy, heavy stuff that is scary. And when I, as an environmentalist, would talk to people, you would see a close down because people get frightened and they don't want to deal with something that they don't know what to do. October 22nd, the Green Grannies of Charlottesville and Albemarle are going to do a flash mob in Ix Park Market Saturday at 11 o'clock. And what we're wanting is for everyone to get out, and what it's all about is to vote for the climate, for the planet. So I'm looking at everybody here and saying, we're asking the environmental groups to table and educate as the grannies and everybody who will be willing to step out with a bunch of eccentric looking people, making it fun, but very serious. Vote for the planet. So I invite everybody to join the grannies. I invited Bob Good and Josh Thurnberg to lead us. I wonder who's going to show up. But it can't be political. It has to be bipartisan. So please join us.
Thank you for the invitation.
You're bringing up like this idea about like a lot of this is basic education that many people didn't get. I mean, I don't remember learning a lot of this stuff. Maybe I did, but and it's easy to when you've been focused on something to get pretty far down into the the report. And but that's what I meant by consciousness. Like what I hope to see in 20 years is that it is not. People don't glaze over. They understand the implications of when you do this, it does this, right? The downstream. They understand that and they go, wait, we don't want to do that because it has that effect. The thing that really makes me crazy right now is the unforeseen consequences when we take a measure. And I'll beat up on electric vehicles for a minute. The fires that are happening from the charging banks that are poorly designed or poorly placed are insane. And those are just a downstream effect that we didn't, it feels like we didn't think that through well enough. And I think that what we'll see in 20 years is just a much greater education. But thank you for bringing up education, because I think that is really what it takes. And I love that the grannies are the ones taking that under, because these guys get it and are can champion it all day long, but I glaze over thinking, well, they'll fix it. They know this and it's part of their world. But I love that it's like we have to all sort of get to that consciousness.
Bring your green feather boa. We have one more question and we're at 7:30. So Gabe, if you could address this. Buildings contribute the second highest level of greenhouse gas emissions. Please address that and address that. Where is that? Where does that information show up, either in the climate action plan or in the vulnerability assessment?
Yeah, so that's something, that information is in our climate action plan. I appreciated what you were saying, Erin, a little bit ago about mitigation and adaptation are not, they're a Venn diagram. They're not, completely separate, but where we look at the emissions from buildings in the county is in our climate action plan. That's also on our website. And so we have a whole section of strategies and actions specifically geared towards looking at reducing emissions from buildings in the community. Where we just have been working on a draft policy for the county to help us lead by example in terms of greening our buildings. And then there's a number of strategies in that sector of the climate action plan that look at how we can help nudge things forward in the community in terms of reducing building emissions. So in case if the person's wondering, I know we're at time, that would definitely be a great place to start looking at. And it looks at reducing emissions from buildings in different ways. There's looking at energy efficiency. Light bulbs always come to mind for people first, but thinking about our heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, stoves, and then also looking at, generating clean energy on site, someone's rooftop if possible, but also looking at other ways to connect the community to utility clean energy generation. So those are some of the big ones. I didn't catch all of them.
One thing that's really cool that some people might not know about is that when we think about the building envelope and the wind that can come through and older buildings. This building just had a complete renovation of all the windows that would seal up the envelope a little bit more so that our building is more efficient. So shout out to the county for that.
That's right. So the windows are helpful both in terms of the building envelope, like you said, and in terms of drafting it, lessening the draft, but also just helping with preventing kind of overheating from sun, so being better insulating in other ways. And that's also weatherization of buildings is a key strategy. Just want to first thank you so much to each of our panelists. Like really appreciate your coming out and having this conversation with us tonight. And Serena, thank you so much for being part of this effort, co-designing the event with me. It's been really good to have this conversation. I look forward to working with all of you, kind of collaborating, partnering in different ways in the future. Thank you all so much for coming out and being part of this conversation, and for folks who are tuning in online, thank you. Just want to say a final kind of closing remark is that this event is really the beginning of, like we said, our climate adaptation and resilience planning process. And so there will be a lot of community engagement in that process. There will also be a lot of kind of partnership and collaboration among staff across the county with different partner organizations. So we're really excited to engage with you more. This is kind of the beginning and a conversation starter. And the final thing is, it's really, like you said, from the Green Grannies perspective, it's really important to find joy and excitement and fun in what we're doing. Because it can be challenging, but it can also be exhilarating and interesting and creative. So those I always enjoy finding those opportunities in it. So thank you everybody for coming out.
And then, as Gabe said, there's some of the more accessible short form reports up here, and feel free to grab one.